Welcome to our final Pauline Chronology lecture. In our second lecture, we went through Paul's letters to generate a timeline of Paul's Jerusalem visits. In the third lecture, we did the same for Acts. In this final lecture, we are going to compare the two timelines. Now, most scholars agree in associating the first Jerusalem visit in Galatians with the first visit, the acquaintance visit, in Acts 9. These align nicely, given that each is the first reported visit after Paul's encounter with Christ, and both the letters and Acts effectively report that Paul goes to Syria and Cilicia when he departs. Nevertheless, there are some key differences as well. For instance, Paul claims that he went immediately to Arabia after his revelation. Acts knows nothing about any trip to Arabia. Or again, Paul says that 3 years pass before he leaves Damascus for Jerusalem. Acts glosses this time frame simply as many days. Granted, 3 years would in fact be many days, but one usually doesn't gloss a time frame in terms of days when years are in view. According to Acts 9:23-25, Paul escapes from the Jews in Damascus. According to 2 Corinthians 11:32-33, he escapes from King Aretas' ethnarch. The two sources even differ in how they describe the visit itself, with Paul's account suggesting a quiet affair in which he meets privately with a few apostles, whereas Acts has Paul making such a public nuisance of himself that the church leaders have to ask him to leave. The two descriptions are perhaps not incompatible, but they do at least represent two distinct perspectives. Most scholars also agree in associating Paul's anticipated collection visit in Romans 15 with Paul's final Jerusalem visit in Acts. The preceding itineraries align. Paul expects to or does end up in Rome afterwards, and the reference to bringing alms for his nation in Acts 24:17 fits well with the collection that Paul describes in the Corinthian and Roman correspondence. It is curious, however, that Acts otherwise fails to mention this collection that seems so important in the epistles. Given these two associations, the critical question then becomes whether the visit in Galatians 2 corresponds to the visit in Acts 11, the visit in Acts 15, or the visit in Acts 18. Wrestling with that question is the subject of your weekly task for this week. Before turning you loose to work on the problem, however, I need to address one more issue: how to evaluate the absolute and relative dating data. I will begin with the absolute dates. If you would like further information on any of these points, see the accompanying handout. 3 absolute dates are widely acknowledged. First, as mentioned in Lecture 3, Herod Agrippa dies in March of 44, an event recounted in Acts 12:20-23. Second, Josephus tells us that there was indeed famine in Judea under Claudius during the reigns of Crispus Fattus and Tiberius Alexander. Finally, Paul's trial before Gallio in Corinth likely occurred in 52. Other proposed connections to the historical timeline are more disputed. For example, John Meyer argues that Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection occurred in April of the year 30. He bases this calculation on John's Passion account, which he judges to be more accurate on this point. If we were to go with the synoptic timeline instead, then the death and resurrection would fall in the year 33. Next, Douglas Campbell has argued that Paul's flight from Aretas must have taken place in late 36, a calculation he bases on the difficulty of finding any other time when the king of the Nabateans would have been able to impose his will on Damascus, a city that officially fell under the authority of either Herod Antipas or the Romans in the relevant time period. Third, some scholars have seen Paul's reference to the man of lawlessness who takes his seat in the temple of God in 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 as a possible allusion to the Gaian crisis of 40 CE, when Emperor Gaius Caligula planned to raise a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple. Similarly, Douglas Campbell has argued from the Chitri inscription that 41 CE is the latest Sergius Paulus could have been proconsul in Cyprus. This inscription describes Sergius Paulus as serving in that role under an emperor. Unfortunately, the stone breaks off right where the emperor's name would have appeared. Campbell argues, however, that in just the right light and at just the right angle, one can still make out a slight dimple that would have been part of the carving and not part of the break. The only emperors whose names would have involved a dimple at that particular spot would then be Tiberius or Gaius Caligula, the latter and later of which was assassinated in 41. The date of Claudius's expulsion of the Jews from Rome that leads to Priscilla and Aquila's traveling to Corinth where they meet Paul is also disputed. 5th century historian Orosius claims that the expulsion occurred in 49, but he claims to have gotten this information from Josephus, who never mentions such an expulsion. Roman historian Suetonius does mention an expulsion because of Chrestus, which many scholars understand as a pagan misunderstanding of Christ, but it is not clear when this would have occurred. Another Roman historian, Cassius Dio, does not mention an expulsion, but does mention Claudius's banning of Jewish assemblies in 41. Some scholars argue that this banning of assemblies is the true event that stands behind Luke's expulsion. Finally, we don't know when Festus succeeds Felix as proconsul of Judea. We do know that Felix takes office in 52. He is eventually called back to Rome and is saved from total degradation only by the intercession of his stepbrother Pallas. Nero relieves Pallas of his duties in 55, leading some interpreters to suggest that Pallas could not have successfully interceded for Felix after 55. Pallas, however, was wealthy, and the wealthy never really lose their influence. Most scholars accordingly date the changeover to 58 or 59. Significantly, Paul begins his initial defense before Felix in Acts 24:12 by acknowledging that Felix has been a judge of Israel, quote, for many years, end quote. So that is the data. 2 points, however, seem especially important for Pauline chronology. First, dating Paul's trial before Gallio in Corinth to 52 provides a significant reference point because it is so widely accepted. Second, Campbell's contention that Paul fled from Damascus in late 36, and I find his argument rather compelling, is extremely useful because this event is mentioned in both Acts and, significantly, Paul's letters. Adding it to our timeline then gives us an absolute reference to ground the relative intervals. This observation then leads to my final point. How do we calculate intervals? Here we have 2 issues. 1, the ancients counted inclusively. In other words, they identified the starting point as 1 rather than 0, as we do today. So, for example, the ancients described the Olympics as occurring every 5 years. Today, we report the same interval as every 4. Or again, inclusive counting explains how Jesus was raised on the 3rd day. He died on Friday, day 1, was in the grave on Saturday, day 2, and was raised on Sunday, day 3. The second issue is whether Paul is counting his years based on the Jewish calendar or the Roman calendar. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, typically occurs around September. Let's look then at how to calculate Paul's 3-year interval that culminates in his flight from Damascus. If the flight takes place in late 36, counting backwards in Jewish years, would be year 1, year 2, and year 3, 3 years ago, would place us somewhere in 34 or 35. If we're using the Roman calendar, year 1 would take us back to the beginning of 36, year 2 would be year 35, and 3 years ago would be year 34. This may seem counterintuitive, but we do the same thing. If a student were to finish her degree program at Hood in December 2014, and was then asked in January of 2016 when she had finished, she would probably say 2 years ago, even though in actuality it was only a year and a few days. Of course, if she were counting inclusively, then she would have said 3 years ago. The young 2016 would be year 1, 2015 year 2, and 2014 year 3. It works the same way going forward. So, from again that late date in 36, counting forward, year 1 in the Jewish year would be 36 or 37. Year 2 would be 37 to 38, and 3 would be 38 to 39. And we could continue that on out for the 11 or 14 years. Similarly, with Roman years, year 1, year 2 would be 37, and year 3 would be 38. Combining the intervals with the absolute dates then produce the following results. Paul flees Damascus in 36, then his initial encounter with Christ would have been in 34 or 35, likely 34. Similarly, his second Jerusalem visit would have taken place probably in either 48 or 50, depending on when the interval begins. So there we have it. Might also be good to remember from Lecture 3 that Luke seems to associate the Acts 11 visit with events occurring in 43-44 CE. Well, now you have the various pieces of the Pauline chronology puzzle. Have fun trying to figure out how to combine the timelines for your weekly task, and we will discuss your results in class. See you then!